Welcome to the Hodja on Architecture podcast. Concept in Design, Chapter 10, Futures from Concept to Myth. Throughout this season, we have treated the concept not as a stylistic label or a presentation tool, but as a structural way of thinking. We have discussed how concepts emerge, how they are formed, taught, communicated, criticized, and repaired. At this point, however, a further question becomes unavoidable. What happens to concepts over time? When do they stop behaving like tools and begin operating as something larger, something cultural, symbolic, even mythic? This episode begins with a critical but straightforward observation. Strong concepts do not remain confined to individual projects. When a conceptual framework is repeated, shared, taught, and normalized, it gradually exceeds its original context. It becomes transferable. It becomes recognizable. Eventually, it becomes unquestioned. At that moment, the concept no longer functions merely as a design strategy. It enters the realm of myth. Here, myth should not be understood as fiction or fantasy. In cultural terms, myth is a shared narrative that organizes meaning. It explains why things are done in a certain way without requiring constant justification. Myths are powerful precisely because they feel natural. They operate beneath conscious reasoning, shaping judgment, taste, and expectation. In architecture and interior design, many of the ideas we treat as neutral or technical are, in fact, mythic constructions. Consider how often we encounter statements such as good design is minimal, form follows function, or honest materials speak for themselves. These are not empirical truths. They are condensed narratives, myths that emerged from specific historical, social, and ideological contexts. Over time, they solidified into professional common sense. Once that happens, the original conceptual reasoning fades, but the narrative remains. This transformation from concept to myth follows a pattern. First, a concept is developed to address a specific problem or condition. Then, it proves effective and is repeated. Through repetition, it gains authority. Through teaching, it gains legitimacy. Through visual and verbal consistency, it gains recognizability. Eventually, it becomes detached from its original context and circulates as a general rule. At this stage, the concept no longer invites questioning, it demands compliance. Narrative frameworks play a central role in this process. A concept becomes mythic not because it is correct, but because it is well told. Narratives stabilize meaning. They allow ideas to travel intact across time and geography. In design education, narrative clarity is often praised, and rightly so. But clarity also accelerates myth-making. The clearer the story, the easier it is to reproduce without reflection. This dual nature of narrative power creates a tension. On one hand, narrative frameworks are essential for thinking, teaching, and communicating design. On the other hand, they can harden into dogma. When a concept becomes a myth, it ceases to function as a tool for exploration and instead serves as a boundary for thought. At that point, critique becomes difficult, and innovation becomes performative rather than structural. In the previous episode, we discussed the problem of the fake concept. Superficial ideas that imitate conceptual thinking without possessing internal logic. Myths produce a different but related risk. While fake concepts lack depth from the beginning, myths possess depth but resist renewal. They are not empty, they are rigid. They offer ready-made answers and discourage alternative narratives. In this sense, myths can be more dangerous than weak concepts because they appear authoritative. Architecture is particularly vulnerable to this condition because it operates at the intersection of culture, memory, and representation. Built forms persist. They anchor narratives in physical space. When a conceptual myth becomes embedded in architecture, it gains material permanence. Entire cities can become expressions of unexamined ideas. Styles, planning principles, and spatial hierarchies can survive long after the conditions that produced them have disappeared. This is why understanding the future of conceptual thinking requires engaging with myth rather than avoiding it. The task is not to eliminate myths, that is neither possible nor desirable, but to recognize them as narratives rather than truths. Designers must learn to ask, where did this idea come from? What problem was it initially trying to solve? Under what conditions does it still make sense, and where does it begin to limit thought? At this point, conceptual thinking reaches a threshold. Beyond this, the designer is no longer simply producing frameworks, but is instead engaging with cultural memory. Concepts begin to operate across generations. They shape how design is evaluated, remembered, and canonized. This is where futures are formed, not through prediction, but through narrative continuity. Looking forward, this shift demands a different kind of literacy. Designers must become capable of reading myths spatially. They must recognize how narratives are embedded in plans, sections, materials, and spatial sequences. They must understand that architecture does not merely express myths, it actively produces them. Every repeated gesture contributes to a larger story about what design is and what it should be. This is also where architecture and interior design reconnect with ancient forms of storytelling. Long before design disciplines existed, space was used to encode cosmology, belief, and social order. Temples, houses, cities, and landscapes functioned as narrative systems. They told stories about gods, origins, power, and identity. In this sense, myth and space have always been inseparable. As we move forward, the question is no longer whether design uses narratives, but which narratives it chooses to sustain. Which stories are repeated and which are silenced? Which myths remain productive and which have become obstacles? Addressing these questions requires moving beyond technique to interpretation. This episode marks the end of Season 5, not because the discussion of concepts is complete, but because it has reached its conceptual horizon. We have followed the concept from definition to formation, from pedagogy to communication, from critique to repair. We now arrive at the point at which concepts exceed their disciplinary boundaries and enter the cultural imagination. In the following season, we turn directly to this terrain. We will explore how myths shape architecture and interior space, beginning with ancient narratives and moving through their spatial translations. We will read mythology not as symbolism but as spatial logic and examine how stories of gods, heroes, and origins continue to organize the way we build, inhabit, and remember space. This concludes the Concept in Design Chapter 10, Futures, From Concept to Myth. Thanks for listening. See you in the next season.